pros at doing this. Let's start with who wants to be our reporter, and Mark is off the hook. Rich is off the hook, but I don't think he's here anyway. Who else? Who would like to be the rapporteur on here? Clay's off the hook. Any volunteers? I'm gonna pick somebody.
Carolyn's given you a recommendation, Stephen, in chat.
Okay, I don't have my chat open. Is Jeff here? Jeff.
I'm here, but I have another meeting at 3:20 that would make it difficult for me to do this job.
Okay. Other folks. Keith,
I think
are
we need
you
to get
interested?
some gender balance with this anyhow.
Keith, would you be willing? Dr. Ferdinand?
I can barely keep up with myself. You and my organization.
Okay. One more try. Ed.
I'll do it. I'll do it.
Okay, yes. Three's a charm. Thank you. All right, so before we go into the discussion, let me just review the potential goals, and we can comment on them and suggest any specific changes before we move into it. So decentralized clinical trials, using digital tools, increasing local capacity for innovation, collating efforts to frame new technologies, develop and deploy systems and tools to combine data sources, incorporate patient input into research, and advancing analytics. And maybe the staff could put those up in chat if they're not already there, just so people can have them in front of them. So I guess with those goals in mind, and then also considering what we just heard, and I know Rob in particular packed a tremendous amount in that his presentation. What do you all think of these digital technological goals? Is there something missing, or do we want to modify these? Let's start out with that. And Erica, and if you can use the hand raising tool, which is click on reactions, and then you'll see it at the bottom, but I'll look for hands as well. So go ahead, Erica. You're muted.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I have to jump off very quickly, but I really was pleased as a leader in patient communities in his mention of the health learning systems. I'm jumping into that and recommending to all of my colleagues leadership in patient communities to consider this next step, which is the health learning systems that are out there. So I just wanted you to know how I'm totally grateful to hear his endorsement for this idea. It's going to be happening. It's going to take time. It's a major step up for patients, but it'll pay off in spades, I predict. And I just wanted you all to know my total endorsement for that.
Thanks. I see Jeff's hand raised.
So I think that and I want to respond to what Erica just said. I think it's important to understand that each learning health system is it may end up being very local. And I actually would be interested to see what Keith thinks about this. But the lessons you learn I think will be determined a lot by your local culture. And that what we don't want to have is someone taking data from many, many places and amalgamating it and telling us what to do. So that was one of the issues about learning health systems. My concern always about the use of electronic data has to do with the accuracy of the data contained therein. And I think that we need to be careful that we can come up with ways to make sure that what we know about someone is actually true. Mm-hmm. And I look at my own trackers. I have lots of trackers on me at any given time. And they're reasonably okay. It's probably better than me logging in and putting some stuff down. But if it really depended on precision, then we need to make sure that we understand the precision or lack thereof of the data acquisition algorithms that we're going to be using, so that we don't have a problem with a disconnect at the interface between what actually happened and what the system's reported as happening.
Thanks. Yep.
Can I just add to that point, making sure they're representative as well, right? I think it's really difficult to go back and change your medical record. So if that's being used for other purposes, having the patient have an opportunity to correct the record, I think is critical.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, this is Keith. I think the use of electronic health records will make it easier to enroll large numbers of people quickly. And I'm thinking about my own experience with electronic records is they tend to be less descriptive than in-person visits, because whatever the person tells you, that's what you write down. And we have electronic communication for heart rate and blood pressure through some of the new devices, but that's about it. You can draw blood at a regular station and then put it into a record. But a lot of the subjective symptoms that you have in clinical trials are going to be lost, or they're going to be distorted. And we may miss some early signals and really bad things.
Yep, thanks.
On the other hand, Keith, I think that we may learn new ways of picking up early signals for bad things that we're missing now because of full data collection. I'm an asthma doctor, COPD, and one of the things I like to get an idea of is how much my patients are moving around. And because it's easy for them to become sedentary, and it would be nice to have some idea of that. Now, I do know that fitness trackers and move trackers are easy to fool. And so, for example, one of my hobbies is woodworking, and I go down in my basement on a weekend and I'm start sanding away by hand. I'm putting in thousands of steps. You know?
Right.
Well,
all I'm doing is moving 6 inches.
There's actually a study going on now with Johnson & Johnson called Heartline, in which they're using the Apple Watch to determine heart rate and rhythm throughout 24 hours. And the goal is to get 100,000 people and then see how many people have atrial fibrillation and are unaware of it. So it's actually being utilized. But artifact still becomes a problem. And patients, as you just said with woodworking, there's actual commercial on television. I know you don't watch a lot of television, but the lady's sitting in the park bench and she put her track on her dog and let her dog go get the ball.
Yeah. We got that's a really good point. We got a suggestion coming in from Slack from the group that's not in the breakout, but is listening to us, which I think is really relevant, which is, you all can see it there in the chat. What are patients getting out of all this data collection? And, it's easy to argue that if you're not making the data that you're collecting in some way valuable to the patients, they're not going to be very enthusiastic about its collection. And I don't think it's that hard to do that. You can create a monthly report for people and, but just going through the thought process of, how can we make this a win-win for patients and researchers is a very valuable point. So thanks, Deborah.
I'm not trying to monopolize, but I think it's actually works sometimes. As I said, as a lung doctor, I have patients that are having asthma exacerbations and they're slowing down, and we put them on something, and then because they share their movements with me, I'm able to send them a text message the next couple of days to say, it looks like you're doing better. Is that really the case? Because you're moving around more, you're not as sedentary as you were when you were having your asthma exacerbation. And I often get a smile back. So they know that we're using the information they're giving us to help in our decision making. And I think that makes people feel that the decision making is actually valuable. The information is actually valuable to the medical system. Now, if that then went beyond the doctor-patient relationship into research sorts of stuff, I could see how it would work. We just need to have validation that what we're getting is in fact true. I'm in favor of it, but like many other things, anything we do where a system can be gamed, like the dog that Keith just told me about, I missed that. You should write missing out by not watching television. There's always a way to fool it. And so keeping honesty in the system is going to be probably more difficult than we think.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
So we have a couple of hands up. I think Clay has a hand up. I have a hand up.
Oh, yes. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Clay.
First. Ed, why don't you go? Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. So this is kind of in the context of what's in it for patients, but in the clinical trial context, there's always this hand-wringing conversation about, are we even giving the information back to patients? So they participate, and part of the value proposition is, what do they get out of it? Sometimes they don't even know the study's over or what happened. And so a responsibility to clarify what is okay. Now, it may not be prudent to be giving them the information literally while they're participating in the study, because that can have some effects. But at least clarifying guidance, what can we give them? What should we intend to give them on the back end? It becomes even more important when you're collecting it from sensors, and then you start talking about the volume of data and what do they already have access to or not. But that exchange of information doesn't have to be just the monetary incentive, but like, okay, so what was in this? What did I contribute? What did I learn? And that should be a pretty easy thing to clarify, some parameters or guidelines about what constitutes an appropriate disclosure in the timing and the types of information that a patient should want or be able to get.
Yep. Good points. Thank you. Carla, and then we'll have Clay.
Sure. So I think definitely, the world is moving in the direction of digital, and this is something that's definitely embraced by our patient community. So I think we have to really utilize all the resources at hand, but it requires some careful considerations that I think we've all kind of been mentioning. The things that rose directly to my mind was, again, asking patients which data they think we should be collecting. So again, to the point of outcomes and endpoints, but also things like, which would be more burdensome, a paper PRO or having some digital technology, which do you prefer? Asking patients, measuring maybe patients' health literacy versus tech literacy. Those can be two very different things, and people sometimes could be highly tech literate and less health literate, making a device better. And I think other considerations like assumptions about who uses digital and doesn't. We make assumptions that older people don't use it, but then we sometimes find that that's actually not true. We make assumptions that people in highly rural communities may not have good network connections or internet service providers at all, but that's also an issue in inner cities, right here in my own apartment in Queens. So I just think that for me, it's not whether or not we should use tech or digital, but it's taking into careful consideration all of these issues and finding the balanced path forward.
Yeah, good. Clay?
Yeah, so the other thing, we've talked about technology moving to EHRs, and the other thing that technology really could do is meet the vision that we heard from Terrace King. So if you go back to the fact that, you actually could recruit in a beauty parlor, in a barbershop, in a church, and the person recruiting could be the barber and the beautician and the pastor, and then the consent and all the follow-up and all that could be handled through digital means or through a telephone call. And then that offers you not just an ability to recruit a population that's currently underserved by trials, but also the potential to feed it back in both directions and develop more trust. Mm-hmm. So I just want to not just think about the sort of typical ways in which we utilize technologies, but think about how they could actually enable a more community engaged and personal approach to improving trials.
Are you aware of anybody who's doing this well, Clay or your Keith or others?
No, I mean, I think when we talk about community participatory research, we're talking about, FQHCs, primary care practices in those communities. We're not really talking about it's not quite direct to person. It's adding an intermediary there. It's just changing the setting in which that intermediary works, in their qualifications are different.
Yeah.
No, not yet. The Heartline study, the only benefit is that you can do so many people so quickly using the biometrics, and you can start to tweak it if you're not getting the response you want based on age or region of the country.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a pretty limited thing. You're just looking at heart rate rhythm throughout the day in a bunch of people. It's not as comprehensive as a drug control trial.
Right. Yeah, if we had an Apple Watch that measured blood pressure, I think that could be quite valuable, but not quite there yet.
I think something could be helpful on the last thing that Clay was saying is that there may not be deep examples in the clinical trial space, but certainly for linking patients to care, which isn't it's a very similar kind of step. Hopkins Center for American Indian Health, working with Navajo and White Mountain Apache, and also the University of Illinois Chicago Cancer Center, working through barbershops and salons with community scientists, is doing, and also navigators is doing that. So there are, I think, existing, similar enough examples to which the clinical trial enrollment could be added through a digital platform.
Mm-hmm. Amir, you wanted to say something about biomarkers. You wanted to mention that? Still there, Amir?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think from our perspective, we see a lot of enthusiasm to do clinical trials more efficiently. And one thing that we try to do is to really ask whether there are biomarkers, whether they are digital or not, that could really help patients. And I wonder in that context, if just being able to go away from endpoints to the extent that you can, and really put forward meaningful biomarkers would really help accelerate trials, period, as opposed to just focusing on digital per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's an audience Q&A related to smartwatches that collect more and more data. Do we need EHRs to move more into learning versus reimbursement? I think that theme has come through for sure. EHRs were originally designed for reimbursement, but they need to be used, and they are actually being used more for learning. I've been involved in some of those studies, as have probably other people on the line. It's cumbersome, but it's a current reality, and it saves money in clinical trial costs. So for certain outcomes, in certain circumstances, it can work. So, part of our task, we're running out of time as usual, but is, what are next steps in this area? So what are 1 to 2 short-term actions? And, over by 2025 and then by 30, we've covered a lot already, but any particular suggestions in those the actions on the suggestions on particular actions? A lot of these, goals we've been talking about a long time, and we have made progress, but what would be the step that would allow us to take a big leap over where we are now? Is there some action by a regulator, academic groups, research groups?
So this is my view. I mean, I always try to be really pretty focused on things that can, someone can actually act on. And in many cases, when you're dealing with new in clinical trials, the FDA has to say something or the pharma companies aren't going to do anything. And so at least starting a conversation with the FDA about some of these things, like what would be acceptable things to, this is getting back to patients getting feedback with sensors, for example, around even clarifying how, are there different data quality expectations for gigantic volumes of data, or do you have to apply the same criteria of perfection in all of the data as you do to more limited data sets, which is definitely going to be what a regulatory person at pharma says. This data has to be perfect. Well, if you're talking about 100,000 data points versus 20, that's a different subscale that's impossible to do it. So some level of conversation and engagement on patient feedback, on the utility of the data, and that can even be like conversations around EHRs and some of the FDA's e-source guidance. They expressly kind of disclaim anything having to do with EHR, saying that's kind of their own separate area. But some confirmation that this less than clean data is okay as we experiment on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. I know some of that discussion is taking place in specific circumstances. Apple Watches are being used in some studies looking at heart rhythms and now PO2. So there's people dabbling in this, but it's a good point. And it's having been a regulator, it's extraordinarily challenging to face these new sources of data and trying to figure out where to draw the line. You don't want to impede digital advancement, but you also want to make sure that the data that's being produced is high quality and, as we've heard from previous speakers, can be used for regulatory purposes to drive practice. So that's the tension between getting more innovative data sources and making sure that the quality is adequate to drive behavioral change. Anything else? We've kept our energy level high, but we're closing at the end of the third breakout, so I can understand. We also had a lot of information put on the table by Rob Califf. Any particular reactions to that? Things that he threw out that you don't like, you don't agree with, need to be embellished more. Daniel?
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead first, Esther, and then Daniel and Clay.
Yeah, just really quickly in terms of reaction, I think there is an underlying assumption that if you build it, they will come in terms of patients. I think we need to acknowledge in the use of technology, mistrust and lack of trust, particularly with how data is collected and used without consent. There are quiet ways of collecting data. The patients have no idea their data is being aggregated and used in massive scale ways to generate insights, not necessarily for them, but for how a particular health system is trying to create more efficiencies with their own operations. And then when, of course, there is some kind of a news, disclosure or some, high profile event, it builds into that concept of mistrust. So I do think there is a role to play in describing to patients the value of their data, returning information back to the patients so that they can also benefit from the use of their data, and then creating transparency rather than 10, 15 pages of terms and conditions that you don't have any understanding of what any of that means. You kind of have to sign away that you know exactly where your data is going and how it's being used. So just a reaction to, data is certainly good and technology can be very useful, but I do think that sometimes we don't address the trust issue enough.
Yeah, good point. Daniel?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I did have to drop off for a period of time for an urgent issue, but I'm not certain if folks highlighted the fact that FDA launched a digital health center of excellence in late 2020 with a primary focus on helping both internal and external stakeholders achieving goals of getting high quality digital health technologies to patients and providing technological advice and coordinating and supporting work being done across all of FDA, advancing best practices and help to really reimagine the digital health device oversight. So it really provides a centralized expertise and serves as a resource for digital health technologies and policy for digital health innovators. So I think that's a really great resource as I heard kind of the questions on some of the expectations of data coming out of these devices rise to the conversation. I think that might be a good touch point for folks.
Thanks for reminding us of that, Daniel. Good point. Clay? No? Okay.
I just forgot to take down my hand.
Oh, okay. All righty. Well, this has been a good discussion. And Ed, do you have enough to go? We give a little summary?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm going to wow them.
Okay, good.
Everyone's going to want to join group 1 next time.
There'll be 3 more of these seminars that you can come back. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll just wait for the end and then the signal to move back into the main group unless anyone has any last minute comments.